My name's Colby Brown. I'm a landscape, travel, and wildlife photographer. But for those that know me or know my brand, I've been doing this for 12 years. I spent time working for National Geographic. But at its core, most people know me as a landscape and travel photographer. And the truth is that in the last couple years, probably about 4 years, I found myself gravitating a lot towards wildlife photography because it's something that I'm very passionate about. And there's something that's unique about it compared to most of the genres of photography that I find quite interesting. So when it comes to wildlife photography, if you look at a lot of my other work, like I said, landscape, travel, humanitarian, portrait work, wildlife photography gives me a unique challenge in the sense that I'm working with a subject that I'm trying to make some sort of connection, but obviously I can't communicate with that subject. So unlike if I'm in a studio and I'm talking to a model, or even if I'm photographing a person for travel portrait work, there's much more communication to kind of set up a scene. And with landscape work, yes, I'm working against Mother Nature and trying to work with dynamic light, but it's not really the same. It's its own challenges, but this kind of brings the challenge of both of those together, which I think is why I love it so much. So I want to talk a little bit about here in this presentation, talking about what gear I use, why I use it, and what features are important to me as a wildlife photographer. So let's start that off by talking about what's in my wildlife gear bag. Now, oftentimes when I'm out in the field, depending on what I'm photographing, I'm going to be using one of these three camera bodies. So you have your Sony A9, which to me is kind of like the pinnacle wildlife and sports camera here at Sony. It's a pretty amazing camera, 24 megapixels. It's unique in the sense that you actually have stacked CMOS sensors on top of each other, which gives you essentially 20 times the readout speed which you get from any other sensor out there, which is important when I talk about a few of the lenses coming up. You can also shoot at 20 frames per second, which is pretty amazing, and pure silent, which is another feature we'll talk about soon. The Sony a7 III is another one of my favorite cameras for this type of stuff because it has some of the features of the A9, such as the number of autofocus points. It also shoots 24 megapixels. It's limited down to 10 frames per second, but it's a great all-around camera, one of the best bangs for your buck when it comes to the Sony's lineup. And then if I'm really going for resolution and dynamic range, the Sony a7R Mark III is 42 megapixels. You get close to 15 stops of dynamic range. And it's kind of the king of resolution. So if I need to blow something up really big, I know I'm going to shoot for a company that's going to license something for Times Square, something like that. 42 megapixels is double the resolution you get with these other two cameras. So I potentially will try to use that depending on what I'm photographing. So let's talk a little bit about lenses. What lenses do I use when I'm out in the field? Now, this particular image of a puffin taken in Grimsley Island in the north part of Iceland above the Arctic Circle was taken with the Sony 70-200 f4 lens. So it's a smaller lens if I'm working on a scene where I know I can get close enough to my subjects, but I also want to save some weight. The 70-200 f4 is phenomenal. It's still tack sharp. It's a great, great travel lens. Although you are limited a little bit in the sense that it can't use the teleconverters compared to the other GM lenses, which we're going to talk about right now. Next, you have the Sony 70-200 Sony f2.8 GM, the G Master lens, which stands for Sony's kind of pristine glass, the top glass they make. Now, this lens, obviously at f2.8 over f4, is going to give you the benefit of having a little bit better background blur or bokeh, and it's super, super tack sharp. It's roughly the same size as the f4, maybe a tiny bit longer. It is a bit heavier because of the glass elements inside. So it's good to know going in, but you can use this lens with the teleconverters, which again we'll talk about in a second. My favorite lens currently, or the lens I use the most when it comes to wildlife right now, is the Sony 100-400 f4.5 to 5.6 GM. It's a variable aperture. Now this lens is tack sharp. It is amazing throughout the millimeter range, and it takes the TCs, the teleconverters. This particular photograph of a cheetah was taken in Namibia. I can't really tell if the cheetah wanted to have me for lunch or it just was not impressed with what I was doing. But either way, it was this beautiful, intimate moment where I was able to zoom in into the 400 millimeter range and capture this unique moment between me and my subject matter because I was able to leverage that lens. This is a photograph of a vervet monkey taken in Uganda. Now this lens was also taken with the 100-400, but it was taken with the 1.4 teleconverter and the Sony A9. Now the 1.4 teleconverter multiplies your magnification by 1.4, so on the 100-400 at the long end, I'm shooting at 560 millimeters, which is a big deal. You lose one stop of light, which is your sacrifice, but there is almost zero loss in image quality, which makes a big deal for a lot of us wildlife photographers. This is also taken with the 100 to 400, but this was taken to the 100 to 400 with the 2x teleconverter. Now, for those of you that shoot wildlife photography will know that the 2x for most camera manufacturers out there usually means that not only do you lose 2 stops of light, which you do here, 2 f-stop drops, but usually quite a bit of drop in image quality as well. It's a sacrifice you're willing to make to zoom in more. I can tell you, having shot these with the teleconverters for a long time now, that there is almost no loss in image quality with the 2x teleconverter, which is a big deal for most of us. You do have to pay more attention to details because when you're shooting at 800 millimeters, so 400 times 2, it does make a big deal to pay attention to those details, how you're holding your stance, what if you set it up on a gimbal or a tripod, things like that. But as you can see from this image, it's tack sharp with these images of a white rhino pair, a son or a daughter and a mother taken in Namibia. But it's a wonderful, wonderful setup. And in addition, we also have the new Sony 400. Now the 400 2.8, this is actually my own copy, so you guys can get a chance to play with one over there. But this is an incredible lens. So a couple things that are unique about this before I move on is not only is it 2 pounds lighter than pretty much all the other competition out there, but also unlike the competition, if you can you might not be able to see directly down the barrel there, but most of the guts of this lens are actually in the middle to the front. And what that does is it makes sure that it's not front heavy as it leans, so that when you're panning and moving around, you're not actually getting a lot of pitch and yaw towards what's happening. And that's kind of a pretty big deal when it comes to this lens. In addition, when you pair this lens with something like the A9, which has that stacked CMOS sensor, and you're taking advantage of those that 20 times readout speeds, is that this has a linear motor when it comes to focusing, allowing it to attempt to focus or refocus 60 times per second, which is something that no other lens can do currently, specifically when it comes to these super telephotos. And this is also the first super telephoto lens that is designed specifically for mirrorless cameras, taking advantage of all that technology. So if you guys haven't had a chance to play with it and you're interested in it, there's one over there. I'd love, my insurance company wouldn't let you guys play with mine, but it is worth checking out if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So, as we move forward, so key camera features. What are the features that matter to me as a wildlife photographer? The first one that I want to talk about is InBody Stabilization. So IBIS is super important from a photographer standpoint because oftentimes we're shooting in low light and we need the extra body stabilization or extra stabilization to help us shoot with slower shutter speeds because we don't want to pump our ISO up too much. Now the interesting thing about IBIS, internal or in-body image stabilization, compared to lens stabilization is that something that a lot of the other camera manufacturers don't tell you. So lens stabilization gives you 2 axes of stabilization, your pitch and your yaw. When you have in-body on sensor stabilization, you get 5-axis image stabilization, which is exponentially more beneficial and more valuable. It's something that you can't get, so if you're using a camera that doesn't have IBIS and you're using a lens that does, there are some sacrifices that you're making, at least if you make a direct comparison between the two. This is a photograph of chimpanzees, again, in Uganda. This is a photograph of some of the, it's the jaguars taken in the Pantanal region of Brazil. And the interesting thing about this lens and why I bring it up, or this slide, is talking about silent shooting. So silent shooting is important in wildlife because there's been a number of times where I've been out on a game drive or I've been out in these remote locations and I've been working with a new guide. I show up to a scene with this beautiful animal, beautiful things happening, and my guide or the driver will keep turning back and looking at me with a weird look on their face. And eventually I'm like, dude, like, what's your problem? What's the issue? And he's like, why aren't you taking any photos? And I'm like, well, I've actually been shooting the entire time. They just don't understand it. They didn't realize what was happening because it's truly purely silent. So if you think of something like the A9 that can truly do 20 frames per second silent shooting in both the EVF, your viewfinder, and the rear EVF, that's something, again, no other cameraless digital SLR or mirrorless can do right now. Even the new entries into the mirrorless world right now, some of them are having silent shooting, but you limit your frames per second. So yeah, you can press the button a couple times, but you're not getting the frames per second for those burst shots. They don't want to tell you that, but that's the reality of what's happening. Additionally, I want to talk about the EVF in general for those that are coming from digital SLR. So an EVF is the electronic viewfinder versus your optical viewfinder. Optical viewfinder shows you what your eye is actually seeing, lights reflecting within your prism, bouncing off mirrors, and you see it through your viewfinder. EVS is all happening digitally. The benefit of that is that what you see is what you get. So when you're shooting a scene like this of a mountain goat in Colorado, that as the light's changing on their fur, I can actually see when it's getting overblown or when things are happening real time as it's happening. So when things are changing fast, I can adjust and I'm not going to miss shots because I wasn't paying attention to my light meter every single time as something was happening. Additionally, I want to talk to you guys about autofocus modes. So one of the interesting things happening right now with Sony and autofocus is there's some amazing things happening in the algorithm standpoint. And so in a scene like this, which is of a hinga in Brazil, again in the Pantanal and Amazon region of southwest region of Brazil, is that when I'm photographing a scene like this, historically, I had to make sure that I'm using like the right zone metering or I'm spot metering, trying to get the eye in focus or what's happening. With the Sony A9, the A7 III, and even the A7R III at times, I can put it on wide or even partially zoned, and it knows where I'm looking to focus. I don't know necessarily how it knows. I don't know what magic necessarily Sony's putting in this, but when I'm shooting a wide scene like this, it's automatically focusing on this, making sure that everything is tack sharp. And when you combine that with the 20 frames per second you get with something like the A9, it's pretty magical to understand that these are 16 frames, so I didn't put 4 frames in here, of this happened within 1 second, knowing that the one scene that I wanted was the scene right here, the first one that happened, but as it's moving around, the ahinga was trying to turn its head to try to get this fish actually down its gullet, but I wanted to get that one moment, and with wildlife photography compared to most others, sometimes it's that fraction of a second to get you the shot compared to an okay shot, which does make a difference. Now, something that's really interesting to talk about that is coming soon is eye autofocus. Now, if you guys have been listening to any of the Sony talks up here, most of the presenters are talking about eye autofocus, talking about photographing humans. For those that don't know, eye autofocus is a unique technology that Sony and a few other manufacturers are attempting, but what Sony has been able to master, where if you guys are looking at me and taking a picture of me, it knows where my eyes are and will automatically lock into my eyes even as I move across the frame. In the 3rd generation of Sony cameras, it's interesting that you can look at me, I can turn and turn back, and it's automatically going to find me again. That in itself, and the speed in which it happens, is already 2 or 3 years ahead of anyone else out there. What's interesting, which no one else is doing right now, which is coming out in at least the next year or within the next couple months, is you're going to get eye autofocus for wildlife coming to Sony's cameras. Now, some of this is talking about coming out in firmware adjustments. All this was talked about in Phonokina about a month and a half ago. But it's really interesting to think that taking photos of like a silverback gorilla in Uganda and being able to tack sharp, make sure your eyes are tack sharp every single time, is a really big deal for us wildlife photographers, because we've often struggled with this as your subject matter, again, is doing their own things and aren't necessarily working with you to kind of create those unique shots. Now, another feature that I really like using quite a bit is the rear articulating screen. So this is a photograph of a caiman taken in the jungles down in South America, and being able to sit in my boat and hold my lens over the boat, tip out my rear LCD screen and put it right next to the water, like right on the plane of water, getting the eye right on the right plane, because otherwise if your perspective's too high or obviously too low, then you're submerging your camera, which is not good. But being able to do that and being able to see that and be able to see all that with your electronic viewfinder on the rear LCD is, again, something you can't do with any digital SLR, but is unique to a lot of the mirrorless cameras happening right now. In addition to that, it's important to talk about battery life. So mirrorless cameras, regardless of what any manufacturer tries to tell you, eat battery life. They're all digital. There's so many digital parts happening, so they're hard on batteries. And it's, in the past 2 generations, the first 2 generations of Sony cameras, as well as all of the mirrorless cameras out there, battery life was a challenge. We can only get a couple hundred shots per battery, and especially if it's in cold or challenging environments, usually that was sped up. With the new Z100 battery that came out with all the 3rd generation of Sony's mirrorless cameras, they've not only redone all the circuitry and redesigned the battery, but the power development and how they're organizing the power structure within the cameras has all been changed. So on a single battery, I can usually get 3,000 to 4,000 images when I'm doing my wildlife shots, which again is at least twice what you can get from any other mirrorless camera out there. because a lot of the other mirrorless entries that are coming into the field are doing so using digital SLR batteries, which is nice because a lot of people might have them, but in reality aren't designed for the needs of a mirrorless camera. In addition to that, I also recommend occasionally, depending on what lenses you're using, is to use that battery grip. Now this is not just because it gives you 2 battery slots to extend that battery life longer. It also helps balance things out as you're using those longer lenses, especially like that 400, to kind of balance things on your holding arm, your right arm, and then balance and shoot things handheld. It makes quite a big difference. And then also being able to rotate that to vertical orientation and still use the buttons in the same spacing that you normally would have shooting in horizontal is a big deal, which you are again missing with some of the other battery grips that are coming out with some of the new mirrorless cameras entering the market. So what are a couple tips and tricks, because I think I have just a few minutes left. First is back button focus. Highly recommend this no matter what you're shooting. Back button focus is essentially the idea that you separate the functionality of focusing and taking your shot. So on all of Sony's 3rd generation, including the A9, you have a button dedicated to back button focus on the back. And what it does is my thumb controls focusing and my pointing finger controls shooting. Separating those out too makes me faster, it makes me more agile, and it makes me understand that once I got used to separating out those functions, I can be exponentially better at shooting what I'm trying to shoot. Additionally, an important thing that a lot of people don't think about when it comes to mirrorless cameras, or at least Sony's mirrorless cameras, is that every single aspect of the camera, just about, is fully customizable. So regardless if you're coming from another body or not, every single one of these buttons you can customize to your liking. You have a menu system in there that allows you to sit there and say, C1, C2, C3, C4, all of them can be customized to certain features. Maybe you want instant access to your area mode or your autofocus mode. Maybe you want to adjust your rear wheel so that you can control ISO really quickly. Any of these things, these options right here, can be customized. It takes a little bit of time to get used to moving to a new system, but knowing that you can go through all of this and totally customize your system to fit your needs so that when you're out in the field and you're photographing wildlife or people or landscape or whatnot, that you have easy access to the features that you hold dear. You don't have to go diving into camera menu systems that you might not know. You've already taken the time, you've taken an hour, and you've customized your camera to fit your needs for how you like to shoot, rather than how the camera manufacturer thinks you should shoot, which is kind of a big deal. I'd also sit there and say that give your subject space. Again, a lot of people don't think about this, but if you're photographing something like a hummingbird that's taken in my backyard here on the East Coast, you want to make sure that your subject has a little bit of space wrapped around everything else that's happening there. It's a really simple lesson that it's always easier to crop in than it is to create pixels after the fact. So give your subject breathing room is always handy. Learn to anticipate the moment. This is taken of an African elephant taken in Namibia in Etosha National Park. And what happened is that I showed up to this watering hole and I saw this herd of elephants coming. I looked over and I saw the sun was beginning to set. And then for about 15 minutes, I just sat there with a really stupid smile on my face because I knew what was about to happen. And I framed my image and I waited for the elephants to come by, and not only to get this beautiful male African elephant posed exactly as I wanted to as they were just walking across the watering hole, I also took a series of other images on the back side of the watering hole with a few of the babies getting water with the sun setting in the background. But the reason that happened is not only was I in the right place at the right time, but I learned to anticipate the moment. I tried to be perceptive of what was happening and be ready for that moment in time. And the last piece that I'd give you last piece of advice would be to be patient. A lot of people don't understand this. I didn't really understand this when I started getting into wildlife because I'm used to, again, doing landscape work or travel work, but it requires patience when you do wildlife work. So this is patience not only in the research it takes to get to the right places at the right time, but where to go, when to go, when you actually get there. Vast majority of wildlife, especially when you go to Africa, you're going to have, you're either going to go in the wrong season, or there's going to be growth, there's going to be stuff in the way of the animal. You have to be patient waiting for those right moments. But when it works, when you take that time, it can really, really pay off. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the last 15 or 20 minutes, depending on how much over I talked. But wildlife photography is a great genre to get yourself into. There's a lot of ways that you can start locally, and as you expand out, there's some great opportunities out there. And right now, in this day and age, we don't know how long some of these animals are going to last. So I highly recommend that you get out there and attempt to photograph some of these for your own and have those experiences for yourself. So thank you all very much.